it is my great honor and pleasure to welcome you to this fourth session of our expert YGC dialogues. And we'll be talking about an important issue now, which is the topic of migration. And with us to discuss this are two wonderful speakers. And first of all, we have Alberto-Horst Neidhardt. Alberto is a policy analyst for the European Policy Center. And there he works at the Program for European Diversity and Migration. He works on asylum, migration, and integration matters with an interest in the politics of migration and a specific expertise on EU law and jurisprudence. He is also a visiting professor at the University of Antwerp and holds a PhD in law from the European University Institute. Welcome, Alberto. Talking to Alberto will be Michael Boampong. Michael is a lecturer in childhood and youth studies at the Open University. He holds a PhD in human geography from the University of London, Birkbeck College, and a MA in development studies from Uppsala University. He is the author of a United Nations publication on youth and migration. He specializes on transnational families, childhood, youth, and migration issues. And he, of course, is also a 2020 Young Global Changers. Hi, Michael.
Thank you.
And with that, I would like to hand over to you, and I'm looking forward to a wonderful conversation.
Thank you very much, Ole. It's a pleasure to be on this dialogue. And when we talk about migration, it's something that is really very dear to my heart. Because it's something that I've been working on for quite a very long time in making sure that young people's voices are well represented in migration dialogue. So it gives me real pleasure to, moderate this discussion. And I'm very pleased to also have Alberto Neidhardt, to help us really understand some of the issues that we have to deal with in these contemporary times that we are in. So as we all know, migration is one of the most important, global phenomena. And it is part of human society. It's something that we have all been doing, moving from one place to the other. But for many people, whilst it's easy for some people to move, sometimes it's very much difficult for others to move. And gradually, too, we realize that migration is becoming one of the polarized topics in politics of today. So it's something that we really need to have an honest conversation about. And why is it important for us as young people and adults to have this conversation? I think when you look at the statistics, you realize that young people are very much involved in the movement from one place to the other. And apart from the fact that young people are very much involved in migration, we also realize that there are particular groups of young people, whether it's women, refugees, and other categories of people who are very much vulnerable when we look at all these issues. So it's not just about the talk, but then it's also the human face that we need to attach to this, conversation and really make sure that, human beings are the center of the policies that we talk about. And we all know that migration is not just about Europe, it's a global phenomenon. And as a matter of fact, it affects both the host countries, the countries that people are transiting in, where they move through, and obviously where they are moving from. So Alberto, we are going to start, just to give us a little bit of a context. What do you think, to what extent do you think migration can be understood as or described as a global phenomenon?
Thanks, Mike. And before beginning, I would also like to express my thanks to the organizers for their invitation. It's also a pleasure for me to be with you today. So let's start exactly as you say, from providing a little bit of context. And the answer is, of course, that migration can be understood as a global phenomenon. It is a phenomenon that affects all countries. There is, of course, a lot of internal migration within countries, but we also know that there are many persons who seek to move outside the country of residence and nationality every year for a variety of reasons. Migration can also be understood as a global phenomenon because it can only be managed through bilateral and multilateral initiatives. Yet, in spite of all these, it also remains a very local issue as well. Migration is experienced at local level in our cities, in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our everyday life. It is a global phenomenon, but it is also one which is connected to the foundations and to the roots of our societies. Migration is also a key to understanding the nature and the scale of current global challenges and structural inequalities in our world in particular, as you were saying a moment ago. So in this sense, I think that the work written by the Polish sociologist and philosopher Zygmunt Bauman is especially relevant today. So for those of you who do not know his work, Bauman has argued that migration and mobility reflect the deep contradictions that characterize our globalized societies. And for him, the capacity to move, the freedom to move, is a scarce and unequally distributed commodity. So we have in our society hyper-mobile persons, but there are also those who do not have sufficient resources to be able to move. This means that there are winners as well as losers in migration. The winners are those who can get on a plane and move to another country for work or for family reasons, almost without any restriction. But there are also many individuals and groups who do not have the same freedom and ability. So I think that the work of Bauman is especially relevant in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, something that we will surely also have the opportunity to discuss later, but I can also perhaps say a few words about now. Some groups and persons will certainly be able to travel abroad in the near future. Tourism is opening up again in Europe and elsewhere, and I'm sure that we are all looking at this summer with a degree of optimism. However, for the next 12 or 24 months, or even longer than that, in some parts of the world, the situation will remain critical socially, economically, and politically, and this will also affect the mobility of persons to move across borders. So when we think about migration as a global phenomenon, we also have to bear in mind the other side of the coin, that is immobility, the inability to migrate. And we also need to think about the challenges and the inequalities that are connected to migration.
In terms of not just looking at those who are able to move in terms of the global nature of migration, but also looking into the inequalities and people who are really challenged, if how you categorize them as losers of globalization, which moving forward, in a post-pandemic world, it is something that policymakers really need to reflect on, and seeing how we lift up these people, because as we all know and has been demonstrated through research, there is a lot of benefits that can come through mobility, whether students who are going to study elsewhere or having to find work opportunities elsewhere. So that's very, very much appreciated. And I think I also like the way in which you talked about the local basis from which migration comes from. But moving away, in appreciation of the local appreciation of migration, do you think that, given the fact that migration is a very global phenomenon, do we need global solutions? And to what extent do you think the G20 can play a role in this, or what is the role of the G20? And also backtracking a little bit with these global solutions that I was talking about, which ones can you tell us about? Are there any global solutions that you think can help us address some of the challenges that comes with migration, whether for young people or for women, for refugees, those who are seeking asylum? Yeah.
Thank you, Michael. I'll do my best to answer this very difficult and challenging question. Let me start by saying that, of course, solutions can only be global if the phenomena we are dealing with are global in nature. So I'll try to be as simple as I can be. And I think what we clearly need to work on is a better management of migration, or a stronger migration governance that works for everyone, for all those segments that you just indicated. And I think it's self-evident that governments from the strongest economies in the world can and must play an expanded role in building a more resilient migration system. So when thinking about the G20 more specifically, what comes to mind is the need to promote a safe, orderly and regular migration through multilateral initiatives and efforts. And the group of 20 has already moved some steps in the right direction, I believe, to enable all countries to fully harness the social and economic potential of migration. So before 2015, the work which was done by the G20 had a more limited scope, and this is quite important, and I will go back to this in a minute. And the group used to work more specifically on issues that had a more prominent economic dimension, such as remittances and labor migration. Now, like many other actors, the G20 has broadened the scope of its activities, and it has truly become a key part of the network of global institutions that govern migration. What is particularly interesting, I think, for this discussion, particularly in the light of the COVID-19 pandemic, is that the G20 also started to develop initiatives on this front. And so, for example, looking at the possibility of extending work and residence permits to foreign nationals, or aiming to ensure that in future months, migrant workers will continue to be able to fill up labor shortages in spite of border closures. And last but not least, also ensuring access of non-nationals and other vulnerable groups, access to COVID-19 treatment and vaccines. Of course, there is a lot of scope for further improvement. And I think what would be particularly important, in my view, is that the G20 continues to work towards achieving the goals set in the Global Compact for Migration, which was adopted in December 2018. And as probably many of those who are following this event know, the GCM sets a series of joint objectives and provides a number of very useful recommendations also for the purpose of our discussion today. So among them, the GCM enshrines the protection of human rights, and it aims at supporting host societies and facilitating the integration of newcomers. Fighting against racism and discrimination towards all migrants is also amongst its objectives. So the success of the GCM, in my opinion, is inevitably really contingent on the common contribution by the most industrialized nations and by emerging economies as well. And so the G20 can certainly play a role. Of course, it is also part of a wider institutional landscape we should not lose track of. And there are a variety of supranational and international organizations which will need to make their own contribution, from the European Union to UN agencies and the IOM, the International Organization for Migration. And one important element thinking about how to strengthen the global governance of migration, and I mentioned this a moment ago, would be to better connect the different levels of governance, and at the same time also end the silos culture that often underpins institutional processes. And so migration is connected to the economy, but it is also connected to politics, evidently. It is also connected to health policy. It is also connected to religion. So we need political institutions, but also religious leaders, authorities responsible for health policy, and so on and so forth, each to do their own part. In order to make migration work, global players also need to support actors at different levels of governance. So particularly local and municipal authorities, I mentioned also in a few moments ago. It is ultimately local authorities who are responsible for schooling and housing opportunities, for example, who must build bridges between host societies and newly arrived persons. So it's really vital that global solutions also reflect the challenges, priorities, and knowledge which exist at local level. So unless all of these pieces come together, the global and the local and the various stakeholders and actors involved, we will not be able to develop policies, schemes, and instruments today which also work and are capable of addressing the challenges of tomorrow.
Within the context of our conversation in this summer school, I think one of the things that we also all face as individuals is the challenge of COVID. And it'll be very good to learn from your perspective on the effects of COVID on migration, both regionally and globally. and what the pandemic means for refugees or most of the vulnerable people, and what lessons can we draw from this?
Yeah, so obviously this is the question that all of us are confronted by at the moment. And the pandemic really had a huge impact, a profound impact on mobility per se, since many governments around the world have decided to close down borders in order to prevent the spread of the virus. But it will also have an impact on migration trajectories in the future. So the pandemic has disrupted a number of economic sectors in Europe and abroad, from the agricultural sector to the tourist industry. And as a result, it is possible that unemployment will remain high in a number of countries for an extended period of time. And the high unemployment rate and the change in labor landscape will certainly play a role in people's decision to move, for example. We actually already have some evidence that the recent increase in the number of irregular arrivals in Europe in the last few weeks, for example, in Spain, may be due to shrinking economic opportunities. We also know that in the last 12 months, labor migration was basically brought to an end due to border closures. But the pandemic has also reduced to a historic minimum other cross-border movements. For example, family reunifications were put on hold, international students' mobility came to a halt, humanitarian corridors for refugees were also shut down. And this brings me, of course, to the situation of refugees more specifically, and in a way back to the work of Bauman, which I mentioned in the beginning of my contribution. So it's clear that the pandemic has exacerbated pre-existing inequalities, and asylum seekers and refugees are among those who are worst affected by the pandemic. For example, most of them are employed in temporary jobs or are employed in informal economic sectors in host societies, for example. And so they'll likely suffer the economic shock more than any other vulnerable segment of the resident population. Speaking of the health crisis more specifically, asylum seekers and refugees are also the ones who are typically denied access to health services. More broadly speaking, they are also the ones who are more likely to suffer competition in a context where there are less resources. So from a policy perspective, this means that they may no longer be considered a policy priority. Hence, the rights and interests of refugees may be put to the side to give precedence to other issues. So when we think about the short-term as well as the long-term social and economic impact of the pandemic, I think we need to consider the links between the pandemic and migration on the one hand, but also about these systematic shortcomings and structural inequalities. Otherwise, there is a real risk that the recovery will only benefit some segments of the population or only some regions in the world.
Thank you, Alberto. So that's very interesting in terms of how the pandemic has affected different categories of people, and you outline very comprehensively the social and economic dimensions. And moving forward, in a post-pandemic world, what do you think? Is there any opportunity or hope for realignment, fundamental realignment to how the status quo that we have currently? What can you say about this? Is there any hope, or there's no hope?
This is really a vital question, and one where I'm afraid there is no easy answer. The reality is obviously far from rosy. I just spent a few minutes telling you about what are some of the systematic effects of the pandemic and how it revealed but also worsened structural inequalities. But I am an optimist by nature, so I try to see the glass half empty, and in trying to do so, looking at the bright side of things, I think there is an awareness that going back to the pre-pandemic situation, at least in terms of migration and asylum policy, cannot really be the goal. So perhaps in other policy areas, there will be more of an effort or almost like an instinct to try to go back to whatever we had before. But when it comes to migration and asylum, you will hardly find anyone who vocally argues that we should go back to what we had before, that before we had a satisfactory governance system, for example. We really have to move forward and not backward.
Yeah, thank you very much. We really need to move forward. Yeah, that's a very good point. And for all policymakers and young people to come on board to help in developing the needed policies that can really help foster inclusive growth and economic empowerment of all categories of people. And one of the things that we know about migration is the representation of borders, how borders are used to separate those who are trying to come in and also to, promote certain ideologies about what it means to be maybe European or some people who are not supposed to be part of us. And I think within this context, for instance, we know about the wall that was being built in the US, and we all sometimes talk about the fortress of Europe, the borders, and we would want to learn from you, what is the current situation at EU external borders, and also what do you think are the most urgent pressing issues that we should be aware of as young global change makers?
Yeah, so this is also an important question, and the short answer is that European border states are not under the same situation of intense pressure they were a few years ago. And yet EU borders continue to be under the spotlight, as you were saying. So we have to, for example, we just have to think about what happened last week in the Spanish enclave of Ceuta. And the most urgent problem, in my view, is that we need to reconcile the sovereign prerogative of member states to control their borders on the one hand, and on the other hand, we need to protect fundamental human rights, including the right to asylum. The situation, of course, is extremely complex, and I think it is easy to fall into the trap of blaming one or the other actor, from member states to European agencies, or to shift the blame on economic migrants. However, I think what is clear is that the tense situation that we have, continue to have at European borders, does not have a single cause and cannot be addressed and resolved through unilateral decisions, for example. So it is a rather technical issue, but I can mention that there have been a number of initiatives in recent years to try to address what are increasing mixed migration movements at European borders, and this is one of the reasons why we have a complex situation at European borders. So we do have a number of persons who reach the borders of the EU, and these are not only asylum seekers and refugees, but are also economic migrants, for example, as opposed with to migration movements where there is only one category of persons. And this makes it important to be able to, of course, process asylum applications in an efficient way, for example. And so I don't want to bore you all with the technical details and with the complexity of the legal issues which are involved. But what I can tell you is that there have been a number of proposals which have been advanced in recent years. However, the proposals have been criticized for a number of reasons, because it is possible that they won't solve the situation that we continue to face. And again, we just have to think about the situation in the Greek islands of Lesbos, for example, or in Italy, in Lampedusa, or again at the Spanish Canary Islands, or at the two enclaves, to think that we are dealing with a situation at the borderland which is and can be described as one of a humanitarian emergency. At the same time, one thing that I would also like to mention is that there has been a trend in recent years, and so both the European Union and European governments have tried to enter into agreements with neighboring countries, where in exchange for operational and financial assistance, neighboring countries have tightened up border controls. And so what we have seen is in recent years a reduction of irregular movements to the European Union. At the same time, these agreements, as surely those following this event know, are also controversial, not only because evidently they may also result in the possibility for asylum seekers to seek asylum in the European Union, but also because it may ultimately make the European Union and European governments subject to the possibility of being blackmailed by third countries. So again, we are dealing with a very complex set of issues. I can also tell you that these various issues are examined in a report that, together with the colleagues from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy and from the Migration Policy Center, we have offered, and these will be presented on Friday in the context of the Global Solutions Summit, so this Friday. And for those of you who are especially interested in examining the situation at the border and relationships and migration cooperation between European countries and third countries, you should really look into the Medan assessment report, which will be soon be published. Again, this is a very long answer, and I'm afraid for it, but it is because these are complex issues. And again, to summarize, I think what they show is that we cannot really rely on unilateral solutions to solve problems such as those which are visible at the external borders of the European Union. We need multilateral solutions.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, yeah, what you've described, really points to the complexity of migration, and something that, whilst you place strong emphasis on international cooperation, bilateral and multilateral cooperation, also really strikes a note for the role of young people also to be involved in addressing the complex aspects of migration. And I would like to encourage our participants to prepare their questions, type, or anyone could raise their hands and I would call. But before we get on to the Q&A, one more question for you, Alberto, in terms of, I know you outlined some of the ways in which member states of the EU are, developing some approach to mitigating the challenges of migration, which sometimes can infringe on the human rights of migrants. Also, depending on the complexity, as you mentioned, the mixed nature of migration, not only about human rights or asylum seekers, but sometimes people who have economic intentions. But is it possible to tell us about some of the successful examples of migration policies that have been able to come to bear in terms of mitigating the challenges that we have with migration?
With pleasure. And of course, there are many approaches that could be cited, and also some good models out there. For example, Canada is viewed by many as a leading example. It's a country that is winning the global race for young foreign talents. It's a country that does not shy away from its moral obligations to resettle those in need of humanitarian protection. It's also a country that celebrates cultural diversity. But again, we shouldn't only look at Europe as necessarily as a bad example. EU bashing has become almost like a national sport in many European countries and in Brussels as well. And the bad reputation is not at all fully deserved. So the EU has managed in just a couple of decades to integrate profoundly different legal and policy frameworks and build common European asylum systems. And member states have really have some of the most advanced asylum systems in the world. The EU has also introduced the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And finally, the EU has also surpassed the model of national citizenship. EU citizens can move and settle freely across member states. And of course, there are problems, and we should not ignore them. However, we should also not fall into the trap of tearing down everything which has been built so far. We need to work on what we have, and there are some good institutions out there doing some great work. We need to start from the good examples which are out there. And again, there are plenty others, and I'd be happy also to respond to any questions concerning this specific issue.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alberto. That's a very interesting point you made about not only seeing the EU in a very negative picture. I think there are some compelling examples. I think during the period of COVID, when some migrants were regularized in Italy, was quite a very interesting case in this particular sense. And I think there is a lot that we can learn and also, push forward in terms of policies. And so Navam, can you unmute yourself and ask your question if you can, please?
Thanks so much, Michael, and thank you so much, Alberto. My question is, you mentioned in the last part of your presentation about, your talk about how the US has more successfully integrated migrants. And I think, I broadly agree with you, despite all the news and the walls and all of that. Their immigrant population is reasonably better adjusted. And I think one reason for that is, the fact that you have citizenship in many European countries. You have large pools of migrants, who might be supported by more center-left, even center-right-wing parties. But migrants themselves have no voting power, so they become a quick, easy target when things are going badly. But even when things are going well, your left-wing, center-left-wing parties don't have, can't rely on them for votes. And I think in the Netherlands, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but even a member of the royal family hasn't been able to get citizenship, right? Because of the very restrictive citizenship rules. My point is, what's stopping Europe from adopting this, very sensible policy? You have, sometimes second-generation immigrants in Europe who don't have a chance of getting citizenship rights, especially because, the kind of language exams that are in Europe, most native Europeans can't pass those kind of exams and the kind of requirements. What's the impediment in your mind? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. I think it's you're really putting your finger on one of the biggest issues at the moment, because I fully agree with you that a lack of political representation is surely preventing change from moving into the right direction. And the short answer is, of course, when speaking of Europe as a whole, and more specifically about the competences of the European Union, this is ultimately something that only member states can decide. So, of course, if national governments decided to reform their citizenship laws, we could see, we could evidently find solutions that secure better representation at national level, and these would also have an effect on European politics overall. I think it's also an interesting question because it begs a number of other issues, or it touches on a number of other issues, because of course citizenship is about voting rights and it is about political representation, but it is so much more than that. It's also about social rights. It is also about ensuring that individuals are able to fully participate in the life in their broader community, besides just elections that only take place every few years. I fully agree with you, and I think there are some good examples out there of countries where nationality laws have been changed in recent years. I would hope that there will be more change. However, as you also underlined, the problem is that these discussions are themselves very strongly politicized. And so in countries where traditionally there is a resistance to change because, for example, there is a jus sanguinis system, this is really seen as a paradigm shift, and it's not going to be easy to win over the argument.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's a very good response to Navam's question. I think, as you said, it's a very complex issue in terms of the broader rights of individuals that comes to bear when we talk about citizenship, birthright citizenship. You know, when we talk about migration, as you said, often Europe and most Western countries come to bear, especially when it comes to refugee settlement. But I think there is also scope to really understand, you know, southern narratives, how developing countries or southern countries are also being involved in addressing the crisis that comes with migration. And so the question I have for you is, how can we include southern narratives of migration and refugee crisis into the debate of migration? And is there also a way in which we can frame this discussion differently to make sure that migrants, you know, across origin and destination countries are also not just, you know, seen as a problem, you know, looking at it from a balanced perspective and making sure, as you said, that human rights is at the core of how we discuss migration issues?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and I think it links to so much of what we have already covered. And the short answer is yes, it is possible, and we should really do our best to bring those perspectives into the discussion, and also to provide a more balanced picture when we talk about migration. So at the EPC, the think tank for which I work in Brussels, we've been doing a lot of research and activities actually on questions relating to communication about migration. And this is because the way migration is discussed by journalists, by politicians, and by other institutional representatives really defines how the wider public understands this phenomenon. And of course, just going back to the question which was raised moments ago, the way in which the public understands the phenomenon of migration also determines the possibility of changing the current laws and policies. So this is really an important issue. And the problem is that in recent years, what we have witnessed is a very marked polarization of the debate. So on the one hand, we have very vocal anti-migrants activists and political movements which blame migrants for everything that does not work in our societies, for increasing insecurity, for lack of social and economic cohesion, for rising unemployment, you name it. On the other hand, we also have very well-intentioned groups that try to defend migrants' rights, but do so by pushing an opposite message, for example, of open borders, or a narrative that only describes migrants as helpless victims or persons exclusively in need of protection, often using images of humanitarian disasters or shipwrecks in the Mediterranean, for example, to push this narrative. As mentioned, we've been doing a lot of work in this area, and so there are many political scientists and other researchers who have been working on this topic, and this in particular. And we all think that this polarization of the debate is not helpful. First, because the wider public may not fully recognize themselves in the most extreme positions. And second, because these polarized narratives do not really fully capture the reality of migration. So as to the first, most people, most voters may support migrants' rights and may be, for example, against unlawful pushbacks and violations of the rights of asylum seekers. However, they may also have reasonable concerns about the future prosperity of the countries and the cohesion of societies where they live and come from. So in this context, essentially, many may feel alienated by the polarization of the discourse. The second thing that I want to mention is that, as I try to emphasize, migration is a very complex phenomenon, and this is not captured by the extreme views and cannot really be painted in broad strokes, and as it often is. So let me very quickly give you a concrete example of that. There are many politicians and journalists who claim that Europe is being subject to an out-of-control invasion. And this is one of the narratives that prevent changes, that prevent, for example, a more inclusive electoral law or citizenship laws across Europe. Yet irregular migration to Europe only accounts for a very tiny percentage of all cross-border movements. So, for example, in 2019, there were almost 3 million immigrants who entered the EU from non-EU countries. And out of these, only about 100,000 people entered without documentation, which means that no more than 0.5% of all entries in Europe in 2019 were irregular. And those who actually entered irregular, were many of them were actually asylum seekers who are eventually eligible for residence. So the overwhelming majority of people who comes to Europe comes here because of they want to reunify with their families, or because they want to study in Europe, or because they are skilled or very young, motivated workers. So in this context, I believe it's really important to avoid reproducing the stereotypical image of migration as being out of control. And as you said, it's really important to provide a more balanced narrative in order, of course, to have a more a productive conversation about the policies that we need to set in place.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think what you said also is at the backdrop of the current situation of misinformation and how technology in itself is sometimes creating false narratives about, migrants. And it's really a big challenge for us as young people. How can we take action to address some of these challenges that comes with technology, despite the benefits of technology? So there is another question that we have here from Agnes. It says that with the pandemic, xenophobia against migrants and asylum seekers has increased in many regions. Should we be changing the narratives that we have around migration? Those writing on migration do so with very little reference to colonialism, but without understanding the histories that produce inequalities, we are unlikely to understand contemporary movements. So again, also another emphasis on history, colonialism, and how do we address contemporary issues and the legacy of underdevelopment and colonialism to produce some empathy, or I don't know how this could help change the way things are at the moment.
Yeah, I think this is an important issue, and one paradigm shift that could happen in the years to come is to, of course, involve those who have a migrant background or those who themselves have moved across borders more into the discussion. So the problem is that at the moment that the whole debate is really shaped by persons who have never gone through these in the first place. So there's a problem of underrepresentation, and this problem of underrepresentation may be actually closed by formal steps like changes to the laws that we mentioned before, but we could also think of involving more and more young migrants in the discussion themselves, because it is evident that they are the ones who are affected by the policies, and they are the ones who can shape the debate, including, of course, by going back to the origins of the inequalities that characterize our society. So I would really wish that all of those who are attending the summer school and following this event feel not only welcome, but actually that they feel the urgency of becoming more involved in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alberto. And just for 1 minute, I know this is a youth conversation, and I wanted to get your perspective on, how young people can help promote change. What do you think is the role of young people in all of these things that you said? Can you do this in 1 minute? Yeah.
Yeah. So one a difficult question after another. So like I said, I think young persons have a huge role to play, not only because they are the first ones who live through the policy and the changes, and also to suffer the consequences of that policies, but they are also the ones who are able to shape the discussion. What we have to do is really to think about what will happen in the next 10, 15 years, because that's when current decisions will have an impact on our lives. And I think young people are the only ones who have the mental elasticity to spot future challenges at the horizon. Think, for example, of climate change and climate-induced migration, something that we haven't had the time to cover in this discussion. So in my view, the younger generations are really the ones who have to be involved, because they are the ones who have the resources and the skills to shape the debate and drive change in the right direction.
Thank you very much, Alberto. We really have the power to drive change. And I think one of the things that I took from this conversation had to do with the fact that migration presents both losers and, people who are winners. And to me, as a young global change maker, I think the challenge that is there for me is how can I really help those who are losers in contemporary forms of migration, and making sure that truly human rights is at the basis of the policies that are being developed by national governments. And I believe that there are different outlets that we can use to really foster change in narrative. There is a way to begin locally to really influence this global phenomenon. So thank you very much. And it's been a real pleasure to have different people from different parts of the world. I hope we can, take this conversation further beyond online discussion, develop action projects that can really foster change in our societies. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ole.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Alberto, for this fascinating conversation. I learned a lot. It was really good to listen to you to discuss this important topic. So thanks for being with us.